The shovel felt heavier than it should have in my 18-year-old hands as I stood in what remained of my grandmother's backyard. The coordinates they'd given me at St. Mary's led me to a patch of earth that looked different from the rest. Darker somehow, like something had been buried there for years. The letter from the lawyer was still folded in my back pocket, the one that had arrived 3 days before my official aging out date, the one that changed everything I thought I knew about my family. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how I ended up here, holding a shovel and staring at coordinates that came with my discharge papers from the only home I'd known for 15 years. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. My name is Betty Kim, though I'd gone by just Betty for most of my life at St. Mary's Children's Home. The Kim part always felt borrowed, like wearing someone else's clothes. The nuns told me it was my mother's name when they found me as a 3-year-old, but that was all they had. No father's name, no family contacts, no emergency numbers that actually worked. Just Betty Kim, ward of the state, another kid in the system waiting for a family that never came. I'd been at St. Mary's longer than most. Kids came and went, got adopted, aged out, or moved to different facilities. But I stayed. Sister Margaret used to joke that I was part of the furniture, but there was sadness in her eyes when she said it. By the time I turned 16, I'd stopped hoping for adoption. The older you get, the less likely it becomes, and I'd made my peace with that reality. The day everything changed started like any other Tuesday in March. I was in the common room helping the younger kids with homework when Sister Margaret called me to her office. She had that look on her face, the one that meant either really good news or really bad news. And in my experience, it was usually the latter. Lewis Reed was sitting in the chair across from Sister Margaret's desk when I walked in. He wore a suit that looked expensive and carried a briefcase that matched his shoes. Everything about him screamed lawyer, which immediately put me on edge. In my world, lawyers meant trouble, custody battles, or court dates that never ended well for kids like me. Sister Margaret gestured for me to sit down. "Lewis Reed," she said, "this is Betty Kim. Betty, Mr. Reed has some information about your family that might interest you." I remember laughing, not because it was funny, but because the alternative was crying. "What family?" I asked. "I've been here 15 years. If I had family, don't you think they would have shown up by now?" That's when Lewis Reed opened his briefcase and pulled out a manila folder thick with documents. He cleared his throat and began speaking in that careful way lawyers do when they're about to deliver news that will change your life. "Betty," he said, "3 weeks ago, a woman named Martha Gray passed away in Millfield, about 200 miles north of here. She left behind a will that specifically mentions you as her granddaughter and sole heir to her property." The words didn't make sense at first. Granddaughter, heir, property. These were concepts that belonged to other people's lives, not mine. I'd spent 15 years believing I was completely alone in the world, that whoever had brought me into existence had decided I wasn't worth keeping around. Sister Margaret reached across her desk and took my hand. "I know this is a lot to process, Betty. We had no idea you had living relatives." Lewis Reed continued reading from the documents. "According to Martha Gray's will, you are the daughter of her son, Timothy Murphy, who passed away when you were very young. Your grandmother had been looking for you for years, but was unable to locate you due to sealed adoption records and name changes in the system." I felt like I was floating outside my body, watching this conversation happen to someone else. Timothy Murphy, that was my father's name. I had a father's name. I had a grandmother who'd been looking for me. Had been past tense, because she was dead now, just like everyone else who might have wanted me. The property, Louis Reed explained, consists of 47 acres of farmland, a house built in 1953, and several outbuildings. There's also a small savings account and some personal effects. The total value is estimated around $300,000. $300,000. I'd never seen more than $20 at one time in my entire life. The number felt impossible, like he was speaking a foreign language. "But there's something else," he continued, pulling out a sealed envelope from the folder. "Martha Gray left specific instructions that this letter be given to you personally, along with these coordinates in this shovel." He handed me an old gardening shovel, the kind with a wooden handle worn smooth from years of use. The metal blade was clean but showed signs of heavy use. Attached to the handle with twine was a small piece of paper with numbers written in careful handwriting. 42.7689 north, 83.4521 west. The envelope was addressed simply to my granddaughter in the same careful handwriting. My hands shook as I opened it, and Sister Margaret moved her chair closer to mine. The letter was written on pale blue stationery that smelled faintly of lavender. The handwriting was shaky but determined, like someone fighting against time to get the words down. "My dear Betty," it began, "if you are reading this, then I have passed on before I could find you and bring you home where you belong. I have spent the last 15 years searching for you, hiring investigators, calling agencies, following every lead that might bring me to my son's daughter. Your father, Timothy Murphy, was my only child. He died in a car accident when you were 3 years old. Your mother, whose name I never knew, disappeared shortly after, and you vanished into the system before I even knew you existed. It wasn't until years later that I learned about you, and by then, the trail had gone cold. I know you must have questions, and I wish I could be there to answer them. I wish I could have been there for your birthdays, your first day of school, your graduation. I wish I could have given you the childhood you deserved and instead of leaving you to grow up alone. But I can give you a home now, and a family history, and the truth about where you come from. The coordinates will lead you to our family's history, buried in the backyard where your great-great-grandfather first broke ground in 1897. Use the shovel, dig 3 feet down near the old oak tree. You'll understand when you find it. The house is yours now, Betty. The land is yours. But more than that, you have roots now. You have a place where you belong. I'm sorry I couldn't give this to you sooner, but I'm grateful I can give it to you now. Love always, your grandmother, Martha Gray." I read the letter 3 times before the words really sank in. Sister Margaret was crying, which made me start crying, and Lewis Reed sat quietly while we both processed what had just happened. The logistics were surprisingly simple. Since I was 18 in 2 weeks, the inheritance could transfer directly to me. Lewis Reed would handle the paperwork, and St. Mary's would help me prepare for the transition. I could leave as soon as the legal documents were finalized. That night, I lay in my narrow bed in the dormitory I'd called home for 15 years, staring at the ceiling and trying to imagine what 47 acres looked like. I'd lived my entire remembered life in the city, surrounded by concrete and traffic and the constant noise of too many people in too small a space. The idea of open land, of space that belonged to me, felt as foreign as the idea of having a family. The other girls were curious but tried to hide it. News traveled fast at St. Mary's, and by dinner everyone knew that Betty Kim was leaving, that she'd inherited property, that she had family after all. Some were excited for me, others seemed resentful, and a few just looked sad. We were all aging out around the same time, but I was the only one with somewhere to go. The morning I left St. Mary's, Sister Margaret walked me to the front door with my single suitcase and a box of belongings that represented 18 years of life. The shovel was strapped to the outside of my backpack, drawing curious looks from the younger kids watching from the windows. "You'll write to us, won't you?" Sister Margaret said, though it sounded more like a plea than a request. "Let us know how you're settling in." I promised I would, though part of me wondered if I'd want to look back once I finally had a chance to move forward. The bus ride to Millfield took 4 hours, winding through countryside I'd never seen before. The city gave way to suburbs, then to farmland, then to small towns that looked like postcards from a different era. Millfield was exactly what I'd imagined when I thought about small towns. Main Street had a diner, a hardware store, a post office, and a few other businesses that looked like they'd been there for decades. People moved slower here, and everyone seemed to know everyone else. I felt conspicuous carrying my city clothes, an obvious lack of belonging. Lewis Reed met me at the bus station in a pickup truck that looked more practical than his lawyer suit had suggested. The drive to Martha Gray's property took 15 minutes through winding country roads lined with fields and farmhouses. "This is it," he said, turning into a gravel driveway marked by a mailbox that read Gray in faded letters. The house was smaller than I'd expected, but bigger than anywhere I'd ever lived alone. It was painted white with green shutters, surrounded by mature trees and flower beds that had been carefully tended until recently. Behind the house, I could see the barn and outbuildings Louis Reed had mentioned, and beyond that, fields that stretched to the horizon. It was the most beautiful place I'd ever seen. Lewis Reed gave me the keys and walked me through the house, pointing out the electrical box, the water shutoff valve, and other practical details that meant nothing to me but would probably be important later. The house was furnished with pieces that looked like they'd been collected over decades, each one carefully chosen and well-maintained. In the kitchen, there was a pile of mail addressed to me, forwarded from various agencies and lawyers. Bills mostly, but also letters from neighbors introducing themselves and offering help. The refrigerator was stocked with basics, and there was a note from someone named Laura Gomez saying she'd taken the liberty of getting groceries so I'd have something to eat my first few days. The kindness of strangers felt overwhelming after years of institutional care where kindness was rationed and conditional. After Lewis Reed left, I stood in the living room of my house, and tried to process what had just happened. 3 days ago, I was Betty Kim, ward of the state, aging out with nowhere to go. Now I was Betty Kim, property owner, granddaughter, heir to a family history I'd never known existed. But first, I had coordinates to follow and something to dig up. The backyard was larger than it had looked from the kitchen window. The oak tree Martha Gray had mentioned in her letter was massive, easily 100 years old, with branches that created a canopy over half the yard. The coordinates led me to a spot about 10 feet from the base of the tree, where the grass looked slightly different from the surrounding area. I'd never used a shovel for anything more serious than sandbox play when I was very young, but desperation and curiosity made me a quick learner. The ground was softer than I'd expected, and after about 20 minutes of digging, the shovel hit something solid. It was a metal box, about the size of a shoebox, wrapped in several layers of plastic and buried exactly 3 feet down, just like the letter had said. My hands were shaking as I pulled it from the ground and brushed off the dirt. Inside the box were photographs, documents, and letters that told the story of my family going back 4 generations. There were pictures of my great-great-grandfather breaking ground on this same property in 1897, of my great-grandfather building the barn that still stood behind the house, of my grandfather and grandmother on their wedding day in 1951. And there were pictures of my father, Timothy Murphy, from baby photos to high school graduation to his wedding day. In the wedding photos, he was standing next to a young woman who looked exactly like me, my mother. I finally knew what my mother looked like. There were also letters, dozens of them, written by Martha Gray over the years. Letters to social services agencies, to private investigators, to anyone who might help her find her missing granddaughter. The letters chronicled 15 years of searching, of hope and disappointment, of a grandmother who never gave up trying to bring me home. The last letter in the box was addressed to me and dated just 2 months before Martha Gray's death. It was longer than the first one, filled with details about our family history, about the property, and about the community I was now part of. She wrote about the neighbors who had become like family to her, about Frank Richardson, who owned the farm next door and had been helping maintain her property, about Evelyn Reyes, who ran the diner in town and made the best apple pie in 3 counties. She wrote about the annual Harvest Festival, about church socials, about the way people in Millfield took care of each other. But mostly she wrote about regret, about the years we'd lost, about the birthdays and holidays and ordinary moments that had passed without us knowing each other existed. She wrote about wishing she could have taught me to garden, to can vegetables, to drive the old pickup truck that was now sitting in the barn waiting for me. Reading those letters in the fading afternoon light, sitting in the backyard of the house that was now mine, I cried harder than I had since I was a child. Not just for the grandmother I'd never meet, but for the life we might have had together, for the 15 years of loneliness that could have been 15 years of belonging. That first night in Martha Gray's house, my house, I barely slept. Every sound was unfamiliar. Every shadow in a different place than I was used to. The silence was the strangest part. After 15 years of dormitory life, of constant noise and activity, the quiet of the countryside felt almost oppressive. But when morning came and I watched the sunrise from the kitchen window, looking out over fields that belonged to me, I felt something I'd never experienced before. Not happiness exactly, but possibility. For the first time in my life, I had choices. I had space. I had time to figure out who I was when I wasn't defined by being an orphan. The first week was overwhelming. Neighbors stopped by with casseroles and offers of help. Frank Richardson, the man Martha Gray had written about, came over to explain the basics of property maintenance and to offer his services for anything I couldn't handle myself. He was in his 60s, weathered by decades of farm work, with kind eyes and the patience to explain things to a city girl who didn't know the difference between a wrench and a screwdriver. Evelyn Reyes from the diner invited me to lunch and spent 2 hours telling me stories about my grandmother, about how Martha had talked about her missing granddaughter to anyone who would listen, about how she'd kept my room ready for years just in case I showed up. The room Evelyn was talking about was at the end of the hall upstairs, painted pale yellow with white furniture and stuffed animals that looked like they'd been carefully preserved. It was the room of a child who had never come home, and walking into it felt like stepping into a shrine to the life I might have had. But the most surprising discovery came when I was going through Martha Gray's papers, trying to understand the financial situation I'd inherited. Hidden in a folder marked Important Documents was a college fund that had been growing for 15 years. Martha Gray had been putting money aside for my education since the day she'd learned I existed. The fund had enough to cover 4 years of tuition, room, and board at the state university. My grandmother had not only given me a home and a family history, she'd given me a future. That realization changed everything. I wasn't just inheriting property, I was inheriting opportunity. The question was what to do with it. I could sell the farm, take the money in the college fund, and start over somewhere else. I could become someone completely new, leave Betty Kim the orphan behind, and become whoever I wanted to be. Or I could stay, learn to be part of this community that had welcomed me, honor the legacy my grandmother had preserved for me. The decision might have been easier if I'd felt any connection to my old life. But the truth was that St. Mary's had been a place to survive, not a place to live. I had no friends to miss, no places that held good memories, no reason to go back. Everything I'd ever wanted was right here, a home, a family history, a community that had already started to accept me. But wanting something and knowing how to have it are two different things. I'd spent 18 years learning to be invisible, to not take up too much space, to not expect too much from anyone. Learning to belong somewhere, to put down roots, to believe that I deserved the good things that were happening to me, that was going to take time. The learning curve was steeper than I'd expected. Simple things that most people take for granted, like grocery shopping in a small town where everyone knew each other, felt like navigating a foreign country. The first time I went to the hardware store to buy basic supplies, the owner, Dennis Roberts, spent 20 minutes explaining the difference between various types of screws, assuming I had some baseline knowledge that I completely lacked. But the community's patience with my ignorance was remarkable. When I mentioned to Frank Richardson that I was worried about the approaching winter because I'd never dealt with heating a whole house, he showed up the next day with his son Matthew Gray, who happened to share my grandmother's last name but wasn't related, to teach me about the furnace, the wood stove, and basic winterization. Matthew was about my age, maybe a year or two older, with the kind of easy confidence that comes from growing up in a place where you belong. He graduated from high school with plans to take over his father's farm eventuality, and he knew everything about rural life that I didn't. More importantly, he didn't make me feel stupid for not knowing it. When I admitted that I'd never driven anything bigger than the occasional driver's education car, Matthew offered to teach me to drive the pickup truck that had been sitting in my barn. The truck was a 1995 Ford that Martha Gray had maintained meticulously, and it became my first real symbol of independence. Learning to drive on country roads with Matthew as my instructor was terrifying and exhilarating, and the truck felt enormous compared to anything I'd ever been in. And the idea that I could just drive anywhere, anytime, without asking permission or explaining where I was going, was intoxicating. But it was during those driving lessons that I started to understand what community really meant. Matthew would point out different farms and tell me about the families who lived there, about how they helped each other during harvest season, about how they'd rallied around my grandmother during her final illness. He explained the unspoken rules of rural life, the way people looked out for each other without being asked, the way favors were given and returned without keeping score. It was a completely different way of living than anything I'd experienced. At St. Mary's, every resource was limited. Every kindness had to be rationed. Every relationship was temporary because kids aged out or got moved or adopted. Here, people seem to operate from an assumption of abundance, of permanence, of mutual obligation that went both ways. The first time I experienced this directly was in late April, when a late spring storm knocked down a large branch from the oak tree in my backyard. The branch was too big for me to move alone, and I was standing in the yard trying to figure out what to do when Frank Richardson appeared with a chainsaw and two of his neighbors. They spent the afternoon cutting up the branch, stacking the wood for winter firewood, and cleaning up the debris. When I tried to pay them, or at least buy them lunch, they looked at me like I'd suggested something mildly offensive. "This is what neighbors do," Frank said simply. "Your grandmother would have done the same for any of us." That evening, I sat on my front porch watching the sunset and trying to process the day. For 18 years, I'd been taught that nothing comes free, that kindness always has a price, that you can't count on anyone but yourself. But here were people who barely knew me, who had spent their Saturday afternoon solving my problem just because it needed solving. It was around this time that I started finding my grandmother's old journals. They were tucked away in various places around the house, some in the obvious places like her bedroom nightstand, others hidden in kitchen drawers or tucked between books on the living room shelves. Reading them felt like having conversations with her, learning about her daily life, her thoughts, her hopes for the future. The journals covered decades, but the entries that affected me most were from the last 15 years, after she'd learned about my existence. She wrote about the search for me like it was a second job, documenting every lead she followed, every dead end she encountered, every small hope that turned into disappointment. But she also wrote about preparing for my eventual arrival. She wrote about choosing paint colors for my room, about learning to cook meals that a teenager might like, about imagining what I might be interested in, what I might need, what kind of person I might have become despite growing up without family. Reading those entries, I realized that Martha Gray had been living with hope for 15 years. She'd maintained this entire life, this entire property, this entire vision of the future based on the belief that someday I would come home. The responsibility of that hope, of living up to the granddaughter she'd imagined, felt enormous. By May, I'd settled into something resembling a routine. Mornings were for dealing with the practical aspects of property ownership. Afternoons were often spent with Matthew learning various skills I'd need to maintain the place. And evenings were for reading my grandmother's journals and trying to piece together the family history I'd inherited along with the land. The college fund was always in the back of my mind. Fall enrollment deadlines were approaching, and I knew I needed to make a decision soon. Part of me felt like I owed it to Martha Gray to use the education she provided for. But another part of me was terrified of leaving just when I'd found a place where I belonged. It was Evelyn Reyes who helped me see a third option. I'd been having lunch at the diner, as had become my habit a few times a week, when she sat down across from me with her own cup of coffee and a serious expression. "You've been looking troubled lately," she said. "Want to talk about it?" I found myself explaining the whole situation. The college fund, the decision between staying and going, the fear that I was wasting an opportunity versus the fear that I was finally home and didn't want to leave. Evelyn listened without interrupting, the way people do when they're really hearing you instead of just waiting for their turn to talk. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, stirring her coffee and looking thoughtful. "You know," she said finally, "the State University has a satellite campus about 30 miles from here. They offer a lot of programs through distance learning now, and you could probably do a degree part-time while still living here. Best of both worlds." The idea hadn't occurred to me, but it made perfect sense. I could honor my grandmother's investment in my education without abandoning the home and community I was just beginning to understand. I could build a life here while still building a future. That afternoon, I drove to the satellite campus to pick up information about their programs. The drive took me through countryside I was beginning to recognize, past farms where I now knew the families' names, through small towns that were starting to feel familiar instead of foreign. The campus was small but modern, with programs in business, agriculture, education, and social work. Looking through the course catalogs, I found myself drawn to the social work program. Maybe it was because of my own experience in the system, or maybe it was because I was learning what it meant to be part of a community that takes care of its members. But the idea of helping other kids who were aging out of care felt like something I could build a meaningful career around. I filled out the application that day, sitting in my truck in the campus parking lot, using my grandmother's address as my permanent residence. For the first time since I'd received the inheritance, I felt like I was making a choice that honored both the past and the future. The summer passed quickly. I enrolled in 2 online courses to get started, spending mornings on coursework and afternoons learning practical skills from my neighbors. Frank Richardson taught me basic carpentry and equipment maintenance. Evelyn Reyes taught me to can vegetables from the garden I was learning to tend. Matthew Gray taught me to drive the tractor and helped me understand the basics of crop rotation and land management. But the most important lesson came from Janet Kim, a woman about my grandmother's age who lived in town and had been Martha Gray's closest friend. Janet had been saving stories about my grandmother for years, waiting for the day when I might want to hear them. She told me about Martha Gray's strength during my grandfather's illness, about how she'd kept the farm running single-handedly for 3 years. She told me about my grandmother's generosity, about how she'd quietly helped families in need, about how she'd been the person people called when they needed someone reliable. But she also told me about my grandmother's stubbornness, about arguments they'd had over the years, about times when Martha Gray's determination had gotten her into trouble. She painted a picture of a real person, flawed and complex, instead of the saint I'd been imagining. Your grandmother wasn't perfect, Janet said during one of our conversations. She could be prideful, and she held grudges longer than she should have. But she loved fiercely, and she never gave up on the people she cared about. She never gave up on you. As fall approached and my first semester of actual on-campus classes began, I felt more settled than I'd ever been in my life. The house had started to feel like home instead of a museum to my grandmother's life. I'd painted my room, rearranged furniture to suit my preferences, and added my own touches to the space. The college routine was challenging but manageable. 3 days a week I drove to campus for classes, and the other days I worked on the property or did coursework at home. My professors were understanding about my unusual situation, and several of them were impressed by the perspective I brought to discussions about family systems and child welfare. But it was the practical experience of community life that taught me the most about what I wanted to do with my social work degree. I started volunteering at the regional office that handled foster care placements, helping with paperwork and occasionally talking to kids who were aging out of the system. Meeting those kids, seeing myself reflected in their uncertainty and fear, made me realize how lucky I'd been. Not everyone who ages out of care gets a letter from a lawyer and an inheritance from a grandmother they never knew existed. Most of them face the transition to adulthood with nothing but a high school diploma and whatever life skills they've managed to pick up along the way. I started thinking about what I could do with my property, my resources, and my education to help other kids in similar situations. The farm was bigger than I needed for just myself, and the outbuildings could be converted into additional living space. Maybe there was a way to create a bridge program, a place where kids aging out of care could learn practical skills while figuring out their next steps. The idea was still forming in my mind when I got a call that changed everything. It was from a social worker in the city asking if I'd be willing to provide temporary housing for a 17-year-old girl who was about to age out with nowhere to go. Her name was Laura Gomez, the same Laura Gomez who had stocked my refrigerator when I first arrived, though it took me a moment to make the connection. She'd been living with a foster family about 50 miles away, but the placement had fallen through, and she had nowhere to go for her final months before aging out. The social worker explained that Laura had specifically asked about me after hearing my story through the network of social services. She wanted to know if there was any possibility of staying with someone who understood what she was going through. I said yes without hesitation. Laura arrived on a Thursday afternoon in September, carrying the same kind of single suitcase and cardboard box that I'd brought to Millfield 6 months earlier. She was small and quiet, with dark hair and watchful eyes that reminded me of my own reflection during those first weeks at Martha Gray's house. We spent the evening talking about practical things, about the house rules and expectations, about her plans for after she aged out. But underneath the practical conversation was a deeper understanding. We both knew what it felt like to be 18 and completely alone in the world. We both knew the particular kind of fear that comes with having nowhere to go and no one to call. Having Laura in the house changed everything. Suddenly, I wasn't just maintaining my grandmother's legacy, I was actively building on it. The spare bedroom became Laura's room, and she brought life and energy to spaces that had been quiet for too long. Laura was different from me in many ways. She was more outgoing, quicker to trust, more willing to take risks, but she was also more fragile in some ways, more easily hurt by rejection or disappointment. Watching her navigate the same challenges I'd faced 6 months earlier, I started to understand how much I'd grown. Laura's presence also helped me see the community through different eyes. Where I'd been cautiously grateful for every kindness, she was more direct in her expectations and more vocal about her needs. She pushed back when people made assumptions about her, challenged them when they treated her like a charity case, and demanded to be seen as a person rather than a problem to be solved. Her approach was different from mine, but it was effective. Within a few weeks, she'd established herself as someone with opinions and boundaries, someone who contributed to the community rather than just accepting its help. She got a part-time job at Evelyn's Diner, started taking classes at the community college, and began making friends her own age. Watching Laura thrive made me realize how much of my own integration into the community had been based on gratitude and a desire not to cause trouble. I'd been so afraid of not being wanted that I'd made myself as small and undemanding as possible. Laura showed me that it was okay to take up space, to have opinions, to expect reciprocity in relationships. It was also Laura who pushed me to be more ambitious about my plans for the property. When I mentioned my half-formed ideas about creating some kind of program for aging out foster kids, she immediately started asking practical questions. How many kids could we house? What kind of support would they need? How would we fund it? Who would staff it? Her questions forced me to think more concretely about what I wanted to create. Over the next few months, we spent hours planning and researching, looking at similar programs in other states, talking to social workers and former foster kids about what would actually be helpful. The program we designed was ambitious but realistic. We would convert the barn and outbuildings into small apartments, creating space for up to 6 young adults aged 17 to 21. Residents would work on the farm to contribute to their room and board, while also taking classes or job training. They'd have support from social workers and mentors, but they'd also have independence and dignity. Most importantly, they'd have time. Time to figure out what they wanted to do with their lives. Time to build skills and confidence. Time to make mistakes and recover from them without ending up homeless or hopeless. By spring, we had a business plan, preliminary approval from the state, and commitments from several local organizations to provide funding and support. The renovations would take most of the summer, but we could start accepting residents by fall. The first resident, other than Laura, was Timothy Murphy, a name that gave me pause until I realized it was just a coincidence. This Timothy was 19, had aged out of care the previous year, and had been struggling to maintain housing while working full-time and trying to go to school. He was followed by Dennis Roberts, no relation to the hardware store owner, who was 18 and had been living in his car since his foster placement ended. Then came Evelyn Reyes, named after the diner owner who had become like a grandmother to both Laura and me. By the end of our first year, we had 5 residents, a waiting list of potential applicants, and recognition from the state as a model program for transitional housing. More importantly, we had created something that felt like family, chosen family built on mutual support and shared experience rather than blood relations. The success of the program attracted attention from other communities, and I started getting calls from people who wanted to replicate what we built. I began traveling to conferences, speaking about our model, consulting with other organizations. My social work degree, which I'd completed the previous spring, gave me credibility, but it was the lived experience that made people listen. It was during one of these conferences that I met Frank Richardson's nephew, also named Frank, who worked for a foundation that funded innovative social programs. He'd heard about our work and wanted to know if we'd be interested in expanding, creating similar programs in other rural communities where resources for aging out foster youth were limited. The conversation led to a grant that would allow us to develop a replication model to train other communities to create their own versions of what we'd built in Millfield. It meant more travel, more responsibility, more visibility than I'd ever imagined wanting. But it also meant that Martha Gray's legacy would extend far beyond the 47 acres she'd left me. Her investment in my future was becoming an investment in the futures of dozens, potentially hundreds, of young people who needed what she'd given me: time, space, and the belief that they deserved a chance to build meaningful lives. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd become exactly what I'd needed when I first arrived in Millfield: someone who understood what it felt like to be alone and was willing to help others find their way home. 3 years after I'd first stood in Martha Gray's backyard holding a shovel and coordinates, I was standing in the same spot with a different kind of map. This one showed locations across 3 states where communities were working to establish their own transitional housing programs based on our model. Laura was beside me, now 21, and enrolled in a 4-year university program in social work, planning to come back and help run the program after graduation. Timothy, Dennis, and Evelyn had all moved on to independent housing and stable employment or education, but they stayed in touch, part of an extended family that had grown from shared experience and mutual support. The original house was still my home, but it had been expanded and modified to serve as the administrative center for what had become the Gray Foundation, named in honor of my grandmother. The foundation operated 5 transitional housing programs, provided scholarships for former foster youth, and advocated for policy changes to better support young adults aging out of care. But the most important thing hadn't changed. Every few months, a young person would arrive with a single suitcase and a cardboard box, carrying the same expression of cautious hope and deep fear that I remembered from my own first day. And every time I would remember what it felt like to believe you were completely alone in the world, only to discover that family can be chosen and home can be built, and belonging is something you create rather than something you inherit. The shovel Martha Gray had left me was still in the barn, though it had been joined by dozens of other tools as we'd expanded the property and the program. But sometimes I would take it out and hold it, remembering the day it had led me to a buried box of family history and the beginning of understanding that I had roots after all. The coordinates had led me to more than just photographs and letters. They'd led me to a life I could never have imagined, built on the foundation of one woman's refusal to give up hope and her belief that everyone deserves a place where they belong. Looking back now, I can see how every piece of the journey was necessary. The 15 years at St. Mary's taught me resilience and independence. The fear and uncertainty of aging out motivated me to create something better for others in the same situation. Even the loneliness and isolation were important, because they helped me recognize and appreciate the value of community when I found it. Martha Gray's gift wasn't just the property or the money or even the family history, though all of those were precious. Her real gift was the example of how to love someone you've never met, how to maintain hope in the face of years of disappointment, how to build a legacy that extends beyond your own life. She spent 15 years preparing for my arrival, creating a foundation that would allow me to thrive. Now I spend my time creating foundations for other young people, passing on what she gave me: the belief that everyone deserves a chance to build a meaningful life, the knowledge that family can be chosen and created, and the understanding that home is something you make rather than something you find. The work isn't always easy. Some of the young people who come to us have been so damaged by their experiences in the system that it takes years for them to believe they deserve stability and support. Others struggle with mental health issues, substance abuse, or trauma that requires professional intervention beyond what we can provide. But for every success story like Laura or Timothy, for every young person who leaves us with stable housing and a clear plan for the future, I remember what it felt like to stand in that backyard with a shovel and coordinates, believing I was about to uncover the last connection to a family I'd never known. What I uncovered was so much more than that. I found a blueprint for how to build a life worth living, how to create meaning from loss, how to turn personal pain into a force for positive change in the world. The Gray Foundation now serves young people across 5 states, and we're expanding into 2 more next year. We've helped over 200 young adults make the transition from foster care to independent living, and our success rate, measured by stable housing and employment or education after 2 years, is over 80%. But the numbers, impressive as they are, don't capture what the program really does. It gives young people what Martha Gray gave me: time to figure out who they are when they're not defined by their trauma, space to make mistakes and learn from them, and a community that believes in their potential even when they don't believe in it themselves. Every time I speak at a conference or meet with potential funders, I tell them about the shovel and the coordinates. I explain how one woman's determination to find her lost granddaughter became a model for helping hundreds of lost young people find their way home. I tell them about the power of chosen family, about the way communities can heal individual trauma, about the importance of giving young people not just resources, but time and space to use those resources effectively. But mostly I tell them about hope, about Martha Gray's 15-year commitment to believing that I would come home someday, and about how that hope created the foundation for everything that followed. Today, as I write this, Laura is in her final semester of college and planning to return to Millfield to help expand the program. Timothy is married and working as a mechanic in town, and he volunteers with our current residents, teaching them practical skills and serving as an example of what's possible. Dennis is studying to be a teacher, and Evelyn is working as a nurse's aide while taking pre-nursing classes. They all stayed connected to the community that helped them get started, and they all contribute to helping the next group of young people who arrive with suitcases and cardboard boxes and cautious hope. The original house is quieter now, with the residential program moved to the converted outbuildings, but it's still full of life. I share it with Matthew Gray, who proposed last spring in the same backyard where I'd first dug up my family's history. We're planning a small wedding this fall, and Martha Gray's journals suggest she would have approved of the match. Matthew has become my partner in every sense, helping to run the foundation, supporting the residents, and sharing the vision of what we can build together. He understands that my commitment to the young people we serve isn't separate from our relationship. It's part of who I am, shaped by my own experience of aging out alone and finding unexpected family. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if Martha Gray had found me sooner, if I'd grown up on this property instead of at St. Mary's. Would I have become someone different? Someone who took family and belonging for granted instead of recognizing them as precious gifts? I think the answer is probably yes, and I think that would have been a loss. My experience of being alone, of aging out with nowhere to go, of discovering family and community as an adult, those experiences are what allow me to understand and help the young people who come to us or come to us. Martha Gray's 15-year search for me wasn't just about bringing me home. It was about preparing me to help others find their way home too. The coordinates she left me didn't just lead to buried treasure. They led to a buried purpose, a calling that grew out of loss and bloomed into something larger than either of us could have imagined. As I finish writing this story, I can see Laura in the backyard teaching our newest resident, a 17-year-old named Sarah, how to plant vegetables in the same garden where Martha Gray once grew food for a family she hoped would someday include me. The cycle continues, each generation passing on what they've learned, each person who finds home helping others do the same. If you're watching this and you've ever felt alone, ever wondered if you belong anywhere, ever questioned whether anyone would miss you if you were gone, I want you to know that your story isn't over. Sometimes family finds you in the most unexpected ways. Sometimes home is something you build rather than something you inherit. And sometimes the most important thing you can do is help someone else find what you've found. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, what home means to you, and whether you've ever had an experience that completely changed your understanding of family. Share this video with someone who might need to hear that belonging is possible, that family can be chosen, that it's never too late to find your place in the world. The shovel is still in the barn, waiting for the next person who needs to dig up their own buried treasure, their own family history, their own sense of belonging, and I'll be here ready to hand it to them and help them understand that sometimes the most important things in life are buried just 3 feet down, waiting for someone brave enough to start digging. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories about finding family in unexpected places. And remember that wherever you are right now, whatever you're going through, you're not as alone as you think you are. Sometimes the family you need is just waiting for you to find the courage to look for it. Home isn't just a place, it's a feeling. And that feeling is always within reach if you're willing to do the work to build it.